We are a singing people. We sing at Christmas. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Every ring. We sing at Easter. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. We sing at birthdays. Happy birthday, God bless you. Happy birthday to you. We sing at sporting events. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. We sing to our little children. We sing scary songs to our children. And down will come baby, cradle and all. I've never understood that. We sing when we want justice. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. We sing when we feel patriotic. Oh, sing and you sing by the dawn's early light. And since it's Memorial Day weekend, why don't you do another one? America, America, God shed His grace on me, and crowned my good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Thank you, choir. Appreciate that. We are indeed a singing people, and many of you know that. I got my passion for singing from my mother. She got her passion for singing from her mother. She got her passion from her. Fortunately, she did not get her vocal cords. Very seldom did my grandmother sing the correct note. Seldom was she on pitch, but she was not bashful about singing. My mother and sister were in the church choir, so as a child, I would often sit with my grandmother during the worship services. Every time we sang a hymn, I would cringe. It's hard to describe the sound that she produced. Shrilling might be the best adjective. Shrilling, not thrilling, shrilling. Shrilling, a sharp, high-pitched, piercing sound. And since it was so sharp, high-pitched, and piercing, it cut through everything. She stood out, we stood out, as she seemed to sing louder and louder on each verse. I wanted to crawl under the pew. Doesn't she realize how she sounds? Isn't she embarrassed, I wondered? As a child, I didn't understand that when we sing and praise God, it's not about the sound. It's about the passion. It's about faith and hope. I would give anything to hear that shrilling, singing voice of my grandmother's one more time. And for you to hear that voice, for it was a voice of faith and hope. Soulful singing, spiritual singing, hymn singing, whatever you want to call it, is not about the quality of the performance. It's about the sincerity of the heart and the need of the soul to connect with the Creator in the deep and powerful way that music provides. It's about feeding our soul. It's about connecting to that which is bigger than we are. Paul and Silas understood this. They had been spreading and teaching the message of Jesus Christ, of loving God and neighbor, of helping, serving, and healing people. They had just helped and healed a slave girl who was fortune-telling, but after hearing the message of Jesus, she decided to go a different way, and this made her owners mad. They were making money off of her and her fortune-telling. And the text says, so they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. The crowd joined in the attack, and the magistrates ordered the two men to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. Do you know how dark a cell was in those days? No electricity. Well, this was not only a cell, this was the inner cell, which was even deeper and darker than the first cell, the outer cell. And now it's midnight. It can't get any darker for Paul and Silas, literally and figuratively. And what do? They start singing. And the other prisoners can't believe it. They're listening to Paul and Silas sing, and I don't know what it sounded like, probably not so great. They had to be exhausted. They had to be weak. Their ribs had to hurt. How could they even breathe to project sound? But it didn't matter what they sounded like, for these were voices of faith and hope. You heard what happened next. There's an earthquake. The chains break off of the prisoners, and they are freed. The guard realizes he's in big trouble. He'll be executed for failing at his duties. So he takes out his sword and is about to commit suicide when Paul says, "Wait, stop, we're here, we didn't leave." The guard can't believe it. He realizes that this Paul and Silas are unique people. They have something he doesn't have. He realizes that those who were in prison are actually free, and that he who holds the key to freedom, the one who holds the keys to freedom, is actually the one who is shackled. He decides that he wants to be like these singing prisoners. He gets baptized, and he takes Paul and Silas to his house, and he washes their wounds, feeds them, and I suppose they all started singing. If you struggle a bit with the earthquake part of this story and all the chains breaking off the prisoners, don't let it get in the way of you hearing the message of the story. That God is in the business of liberating people, strengthening people, transforming people, and God often uses music and singing to liberate, strengthen, and transform. John Wesley tells a very similar story. He was on the ship, the Simmons, coming to be the minister for the Georgia colony in 1736. He was gathered with a group of Germans he had just met called the Moravians, when suddenly a fierce storm came upon them, so fierce it seemed as though the ship would break in half and that they would all die. The Moravians start singing hymns. Wesley writes in his diary, "In the midst of the psalm wherewith their service began, wherein we were mentioning the power of God, the sea broke over, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the desk as if the great deep had already swallowed us up. A terrible screaming began among the English. The Germans all looked up and without interruption calmly sang on. I asked of them afterwards, 'Were you not afraid?' He answered, 'I thank God, no.' I asked, 'But were not your women and your children afraid?' He replied mildly, 'No, our women and children were not afraid to die.'" Wesley would write that these Moravians were the gentlest, bravest people he had ever met, and he wanted what they had. And this eventually led to a spiritual awakening in him, and it all started with singing. Not long before he died, minister and activist William Sloane Coffin was interviewed by Bill Moyers. If you're not familiar with William Sloane Coffin, look him up sometime. He was the minister at Riverside Church in New York City for a long time. In the interview, Bill Moyers recalled the time that Coffin was arrested in Washington, D.C. for protesting the Vietnam War. Moyers said that he heard that Coffin made quite an impression on people when he started singing in prison. Coffin responded by saying, "Yeah, it was a group of clergy and laity concerned with Vietnam. And so they were all pretty religious folk, so I started to sing the Messiah, Handel's Messiah, and quite a few people joined in. It was a good night." Then Moyers asked him, "What is it that enables a man to sing in prison?" "Well, in my case, music, after God, had been my chief source of solace. Song is an expression of hope, and hope is something that is experienced with a kind of psychological certitude rather than intellectual certainty. It's trusting that things all will be well when the day is done. Or, as Havel said wonderfully, hope is not waiting for something good to turn up well, but being grateful that something really makes sense. That's enough to make you burst into song," Coffin said. And then he said, "I asked an 85-year-old professor, a great buddy of mine at Yale, 'What makes you cry?' And he said, 'Whenever I see or hear the truth, that tear is a kind of song. It's something apprehended at a very deep level.'" One of my favorite lines was penned by the remarkable lawyer and civil rights activist Paul Murray, who was the first African-American woman ordained as an Episcopal priest. She wrote, "Hope is a song in a weary throat." And so what comes first? Do we have faith and hope and then we sing praise to God? Or do we sing praise to God in order to get faith and hope, in order to be transformed? I think it's both. It can work both ways. There are times when we are so filled with faith, hope, and love that we have to burst into songs of praise. But much of the time, we are going through difficulty, through challenges, and we're lacking faith and lacking hope. And it's actually through the singing that transforms us, that turns us into people of faith and hope. Our country, our world is going through a very difficult time. Our denomination is going through a very difficult time. Our church is going through a difficult time because of what is going on in our denomination. There is a lot of stress all around us. And many of you are dealing with other issues, health issues, family, relational issues, financial issues, job-related issues. I've got a daughter trying to make a living after going to graduate school. I've got another daughter trying to make a living on the other side of the country in California. I've got a son on 151st Street and 8th Avenue in New York City trying to make it as an actor. I have a lot to be worried about. But you see, when I come into this sanctuary and I see you and pray with you, and especially when I sing with you, something happens. I get filled with faith and hope, and I know I can deal with it another week. Whether it's a song of praise or a song of lament, I get connected to the Creator, connected to that which is bigger than me, and I experience faith and hope. I experience transformation. I hope the same happens for you. Last Sunday, we recognized our graduates, and our church gave each graduate a copy of Anne Lamott's wonderful book, Traveling Mercies. If you don't have a copy, get one. It's a great book. One of my favorite stories in it is the one about the church Anne goes to in San Francisco. A man named Ken started attending the church, a relatively new member, and Ken was dying of AIDS. Anne said that he was disintegrating before their very own eyes. Shortly after Ken started going to the church, his partner, Brandon, actually died of AIDS. A few weeks later, Ken told Anne that right after Brandon died, Jesus had slid into the hole in his heart that Brandon's loss left and had been there ever since for him. Anne said that Ken's face is totally lopsided, ravaged and emaciated, but that when he smiles, he is radiant. Ken said that he would gladly pay any price for what he has now, which is Jesus and his church family. Anne says there is a woman in the choir named Renola who is large and beautiful and jovial and black and as devout as can be, who has been a little standoffish of Ken. She has always looked at him with confusion when she looks at him at all. Or she looks at him sideways as if she wouldn't have to quite see him if she didn't look at him head on. She was raised in the South by Baptists who taught her that his way of life, that he was an abomination. It was hard for her to break through this. Anne thinks that Renola and a few other women are a little afraid of catching the disease. But Kenny came to church almost every week and won almost everyone over. Everyone except Renola. Ken had missed a couple of Sundays when he got too weak, but now he was back, weighing almost no pounds. His face even more lopsided, as if he had had a stroke. On this particular Sunday, they sang for the opening hymn the song, "We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder," which goes, "Every rung goes higher, higher," while ironically, Kenny couldn't even stand up. But he sang away sitting down with his hymnal in his lap. Later in the service, they sang that great hymn, "His Eye is on the Sparrow." The pianist was playing, and the whole congregation had risen. Only Kenny remained seated with his hymnal in his lap, and they began to sing, "Why should I feel discouraged? Why do the shadows fall?" And Renola watched Ken rather skeptically for a moment. And then her face began to melt and contort like his. And she went to his side, and she bent down to lift him up. She lifted up this white rag doll, this scarecrow of a man. She held him next to her, draped over and against her like a child, while they sang. Do you guess they felt the earthquake? Did they notice that their chains had loosened and that they were now free? Anne Lamott says she can't imagine anything but music that could have brought about this kind of alchemy. And maybe it's because music is about as physical as it gets. Your essential rhythm is your heartbeat. Your essential sound, your breath. We're walking temples of noise. And when you add tender hearts to this mix, it somehow lets us meet in places we couldn't get to any other way. Earthquakes happen. Shackles are torn off. We are free. We live in a troubled world where there is a lot of talking and texting, but not too many people are listening. But I think they may listen to people who can sing at midnight. The sad truth is that much of the time, Christians respond to our trials and troubles with the same anger, the same hopelessness, the same despair that the world does. But if we are like Paul and Silas, and if we are like the Moravians, and if we are like William Sloane Coffin, if we sing at midnight, if we express our trust in God and God's love, no matter what we pass through, someone will be listening. The world is listening for such a song. The world needs such a song. Amen and amen.